It was May 13th, 1993. The United States Center in Miami was not yet the arena it would later become in memory. It was still raw, still new. A building that smelled of fresh paint and industrial carpet, and the particular anxiety of a city that had never hosted basketball at this level before. The temperature outside hovered at 81 degrees at 9 in the night, and inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against 14,000 bodies packed into every available seat, every aisle, every inch of standing room that the fire marshal would permit, and several inches that he would not. The floor itself was damp at the edges where sweat had migrated from the paint to the hardwood, and the ball skidded in ways that only the players could feel and only the veterans could predict. This was Game 3 of the 1993 NBA Eastern Conference Finals, and the Miami Heat, young, loud, physically enormous, coached by Kevin Loughery with the specific fury of a man who believed he had something to prove to everyone who had ever doubted him, had taken the game deep into the fourth quarter with the singular intention of making Michael Jordan's night a demonstration of their own power rather than his. The Chicago Bulls led the series 2-0, but the margins had been narrow in ways that numbers do not fully communicate, and the Heat's locker room between games had been a chamber of carefully constructed belief, a place where Alonzo Mourning and Glenn Rice and Harold Miner told one another in voices that grew more certain with each repetition that this was the night, this was the game, this was the moment when Michael Jordan would finally encounter something he could not solve with individual genius. The crowd understood this possibility. They had been feeding on it for 3 quarters and 12 minutes. And with 4 seconds left on the game clock and Chicago trailing by 1, with the ball inbounded to Jordan at half court, and the Heat collapsing 2 of the largest human beings then employed in professional basketball directly onto his body, the entire building rose in the kind of unison that stadiums only achieve when they believe, collectively and without reservation, that something irreversible is about to happen. The apparent truth of the moment was this: Michael Jordan was surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted, and out of time. The 2 men closing on him were each 6 feet and 10 inches tall, each north of 250 pounds, and between them they represented a physical argument that no amount of will or reputation should have been able to answer. The building believed it. The Heat believed it. And for 1 fraction of 1 second, the math of the situation suggested they might be right. Harold Miner had arrived in Miami that year with the kind of expectations that destroy young men before they have the chance to become themselves. He had been selected 5th overall in the 1992 NBA draft, and the marketing departments of the league and his own franchise had done him the considerable disservice of attaching to his name a nickname that functioned as both prophecy and sentence: Baby Jordan. He was 6'5", explosive in ways that translated beautifully to highlight reels, capable of dunks that stopped conversations in arenas and on television screens across the country, and he played with the specific kind of confidence that only exists in young men who have not yet been educated by failure. The comparison to Jordan had been floated first by scouts and then amplified by sports writers who needed a story and by fans who needed a hero, and Miner had not rejected it with sufficient force to make it go away. He had averaged 15 points per game that season, shooting reasonably well from the floor and with the kind of athleticism that made defenders feel briefly and embarrassingly outclassed. He had spoken, in the way that 22-year-olds speak when they have been told they are special, about wanting to prove himself against the best, about this being the moment that separated the conversation from the reality. In the days before Game 3, he had reportedly told teammates in practice, with the particular bravado of a man who has not yet had the thing taken from him, that Jordan was 30 years old and that 30-year-old legs were 30-year-old legs regardless of whose body they belonged to. He was not wrong about the legs. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. Alonzo Mourning was a different kind of problem entirely. He was 23 years old in May of 1993, and he had arrived in the league the previous year as the 2nd overall pick, with a reputation for ferocity that preceded him into every arena and every conversation about the future of the game. He was listed at 6 feet 10 and 261 pounds, and those numbers did not capture the full truth of what he was physically, which was a body assembled by whatever process produces men who cause other men to recalibrate their understanding of what the word intimidating actually means. He had averaged 21 points and 10 rebounds that regular season, and he had done it with a snarl that was not performative but genuinely felt. a product of a childhood in Chesapeake, Virginia, that had required him to develop hardness as a survival mechanism long before it became a professional asset. Mourning had said publicly, in the precise measured language of a man who chooses his words carefully because he means them literally, that he respected Michael Jordan but did not fear him. That fear was something you gave away for free, and he did not give things away. He had said that the Bulls were beatable, and that the Heat were the team to beat them. And he had said this not in the locker room where it could be dismissed as team-building noise, but in front of cameras and tape recorders, in the specific public register that makes statements into obligations. He had fouled Jordan hard in Game 2, hard enough that the replay analysts spent considerable time discussing whether the contact was basketball or something else, and Jordan had gotten up without expression, without comment, without anything that Mourning could read as reaction. That absence of reaction had bothered Mourning in ways he would not have admitted then, and took years to articulate later. A man who screams when you hit him tells you where the nerve is. A man who shows you nothing has taken your information and given you nothing in return. Jordan had been 30 years old for 11 days. He was in the third year of what would later be understood as his second dynasty, his first three-peat having concluded with the 1993 championship. Still 4 weeks in the future, and therefore unwritten, still contingent on the performance of a man who was right now standing at half-court being closed upon by two enormous young men who believed they had him. He had scored 36 points that night by the time the fourth quarter reached its final minute. But the Heat had matched every run, answered every sequence, and now they had the lead and the clock and the crowd and the physical arithmetic of the trap. His teammates were not in good positions to receive the ball. The trap was textbook. Mourning coming from the left, angled to force the baseline, Minor coming from the right, denying the middle. The intention was to make Jordan pick up his dribble, to force a timeout that Miami would contest, or to produce a turnover that would end the series narrative cleanly, with the Heat having solved the problem in front of the whole country. This is what they had practiced. The crowd was on its feet, and the noise had reached the kind of physical presence that you feel in the sternum rather than hear in the ears. And in that noise, in that trap, in those 4 seconds, Michael Jordan became very quiet inside himself, in the way that he always became quiet inside himself when the external situation had become loud enough to drown out everything except the signal he was listening for. The noise came first, as it always does. In the days between Games 2 and 3, the Miami Herald had run a back page that the Heat organization did not discourage and may have quietly facilitated, a headline in 72-point type that asked whether Jordan was showing his age. The statistical argument was superficially reasonable. Jordan's shooting percentages in the second halves of playoff games had dipped slightly from his 1991 numbers, which a certain kind of analysis could interpret as fatigue, as the beginning of a decline curve, as evidence that the extraordinary was becoming merely excellent. The Herald's columnist had written that Miami's youth and athleticism represented a generational challenge that Jordan's talent alone could not answer. ESPN's analysts had spent considerable airtime discussing whether the Bulls had become too dependent on one player, whether Phil Jackson's triangle offense required a kind of collective execution that a team as physically challenged as the Bulls could produce against a team as long and athletic as the Heat. The narrative had been constructed with the careful craft of people who understand that a story needs an antagonist to function, and the story they had constructed was this: Michael Jordan, alone, aging, on the wrong side of a physical mismatch, carrying a team that could not carry itself. It was not a false story, it was an incomplete one. The difference between a false story and an incomplete story is that the false story can be dismissed, but the incomplete story has to be finished, and the finishing always belongs to the person the story was about. Jordan had read the Herald. He read everything. Phil Jackson had long since stopped trying to control what Jordan consumed in the way of bulletin board material because he had come to understand that Jordan's relationship to motivation was not like other players' relationships to motivation. Other players needed to be protected from doubt, insulated from criticism, managed in their emotional states. Jordan needed to be provided with reasons. He had a gift, or perhaps a curse, for finding reasons in places where other people found only background noise. The headline was a reason. Mourning's public statement was a reason. The youth and the loudness of the Miami crowd was a reason. His own 30-year-old legs, which had been described by a man 22 years old as a liability, were a reason. He had arrived at the arena that night in his customary silence, moving through the hallway between the bus and the locker room with the particular quality of attention that his teammates had come to recognize and respect and, in certain moods, fear. It was not anger. It was closer to the thing that happens to very still water right before it moves. He taped his own wrists in the locker room that night, as he always did, with the precise tension he had calibrated over years of understanding exactly how tight was tight enough and exactly how loose was too loose. And while he taped, he did not speak and did not look at anyone with the expression that communicated anything except that he was somewhere inside himself that was not accessible for conversation. Horace Grant had played with him long enough to know what the silence meant. Pippen had played with him long enough to know that when Jordan went into that silence, the question was not whether he would perform, but only which version of the performance the other team would have to live with afterward. For the first 3 quarters, Jordan had played in the first register. 36 points is a number that would have made any other player on the floor that night the story of the game. But Jordan at 36 points was, in the vocabulary of the people who had watched him operate for years, Jordan in a mode of professional efficiency rather than declaration. He was not yet speaking directly to the argument. He was establishing the conditions under which the argument would eventually be answered. He let Mourning have the post position he wanted on 2 consecutive possessions, allowed him to score and to feel the satisfaction of scoring, watched him come back down the court with the expression of a man whose conviction had been confirmed. He watched Minor push the pace in transition, watched him finish over Pippen with the athleticism that had earned him the nickname he could not escape, watched him point to the crowd afterward in the specific celebratory language of a young man performing his own future. Jordan absorbed it without expression, which is a different thing entirely from not noticing it. He was building something in those quarters, storing something, letting the pressure accumulate in the chamber without releasing it, because he understood, in the particular way that only extraordinary competitors understand, that the value of the answer is always proportional to the weight of the question being asked. The question was not yet heavy enough. He needed it heavier. The second layer began building in the 4th quarter, approximately 9 minutes before the trap. Jordan began making shots that were not spectacular in themselves but were spectacular in their timing, arriving at the precise moment when the Heat's momentum had built enough energy that its interruption was maximally disruptive. A mid-range jumper from the left elbow, taken early and without apparent hesitation, that went through the net with the specific sound that well-struck jump shots produce, a sound that is slightly different from a lucky shot and that players can distinguish at distance because the feedback lives in the hands and the ears simultaneously. A pull-up from the free throw line off a screen from Bill Cartwright over Minor's outstretched hand, that Minor contested well and that went in anyway. Each basket was delivered not with celebration, but with the economy of a man who is doing what he expected to do and who needs you to understand that. He was not yet showing Mourning everything. He was showing him enough to make the closing show more expensive, more devastating, more complete. Mourning felt it. You could see it in the way he began talking on defense, filling the silence with words in the specific way that players talk when the silence has started to feel dangerous. He was managing something that he would not have named as anxiety, but that functioned as anxiety. A growing awareness that the thing he believed about this game was being quietly, systematically, and personally challenged. The Heat held the lead, but holding the lead had begun to feel like holding on to something that wanted to leave. The trap was their answer to the feeling. With 4 seconds on the game clock and Miami up by 1, Lafrey made the call with the authority of a man who had prepared for this exact moment. Mourning to the left, Minor to the right. Seal the middle. Force the baseline or force a dead ball situation. The crowd understood what was being built. They came to their feet in a single motion, 14,000 people making the collective decision to witness the moment when the narrative would be settled in their favor. The noise was physical. The air moved. The floor vibrated in the way that floors vibrate when that many people are that focused on the same point in space. And that point was Michael Jordan, standing at half court with the ball, watching the trap close with the specific quality of attention of a man who has been in traps before, and who has a particular relationship with traps, which is that he finds them interesting rather than frightening, that they simplify the situation in ways that complexity never can, that they tell him exactly where the walls are, which tells him exactly where the opening will be. 4 seconds, the trap complete. Two 6'10" men, their combined wingspan covering an arc of court that no reasonable geometric analysis suggested Jordan could escape, the crowd at its fullest volume, the argument at its maximum weight. He took one dribble to his right, inside Miner's coverage, in a direction that Miner had been positioned to prevent, and that Jordan took anyway as if Miner's positioning were a suggestion rather than a constraint. The dribble was low and hard and without telegraphing, a dribble that committed to nothing except momentum, and in the half-second that Miner was processing the adjustment required by Jordan's movement, Jordan had already begun the next action. He crossed back to his left in a change of direction so fast and so complete that Miner's feet produced the sound that sneakers on hardwood produce when the body above them has changed its decision faster than the feet have received the update. It was not a stumble. Miner was an athlete of genuine quality. It was more precise than a stumble, which is why it was more damaging than a stumble would have been. It was the sound of a man who had done everything correctly and found himself, despite that correctness, 2 steps behind a man operating at a speed that correctness alone could not match. Morning came hard from the left, closing the angle, his enormous body arriving at the position it had been assigned with perfect timing. Jordan elevated, not from a standstill, which would have been extraordinary enough, but out of the crossover, which converted the lateral momentum of the escape into the vertical momentum of the shot in a transfer of physics that the human eye could register, but the mind struggled to follow. He was at the peak of his elevation before Morning had completed his closing motion. The ball left his right hand at an angle of release that coaches who study these things still discuss as an example of what the ideal shooting arc looks like when the body producing it is under maximum physical duress and maximum time pressure simultaneously. The wrist completed its follow-through. The fingers spread in the specific way they spread when the shot has been properly executed, and the body knows it before the ball has traveled far enough for anyone else to know it. The ball described its arc. The buzzer sounded while it was in the air. The building was at a volume that had no more room to go, and then the net moved. Miner heard it before he turned around. The sound of a basketball passing cleanly through a net is different from the sound of one hitting the rim, and the crowd's response to each is different in a way that requires no visual confirmation. He turned around and the scoreboard confirmed what the sound had already told him, and what he was looking at was not a number on a board, but the destruction of a story he had been telling himself for months. The story was this. He was baby Jordan, which meant he was the next thing, which meant Jordan was the previous thing, which meant Jordan's era was ending and his era was beginning, and this game was the place where the transition would be documented. The ball going through the net did not merely end the game. It amended the story at the source, revised its premise, returned the comparison that had been made between them to the person it belonged to, and demonstrated, in the specific evidentiary language of basketball, what the comparison was actually worth. He was 22 years old and excellent, and he would have a career, and he would win a dunk contest, and he would be spoken of with genuine respect. But in that moment, standing on the floor of the United States Center while the Chicago Bulls ran to one another, and the Miami crowd processed what had just happened in the stunned, specific silence that follows the end of belief, Harold Miner understood something about the distance between a nickname and the thing it names. Understanding it once, in your body, in public, at the exact moment when the whole country is watching, is a different kind of education than any other kind available to a 22-year-old man. Morning was slower to arrive at the understanding because he was a more complicated case. His confidence was structural rather than narrative, resting not on a story about succession but on a belief about his own physical and competitive reality that had been confirmed by every serious test he had faced before this one. He stood at half court for a moment after the buzzer, his body expressing the particular stillness of a man whose processing has exceeded the speed at which his external behavior can update. He looked at the basket. He looked at the scoreboard. He did not look at Jordan, which was itself a form of acknowledgement, because when you choose not to look at something, it is generally because looking at it would cost you something you are not ready to spend. The specific difficulty of his situation was this: he could not rationalize the result as luck. He had been present for the entire construction of the play. He had done what he was supposed to do. The play had worked exactly as designed, and then Jordan had done something inside the play that the design had not accounted for and could not have accounted for. Because what Jordan had done was not a tactical deviation, but an expression of individual capacity that exists outside the vocabulary of game planning. You cannot design a defense against a man operating at a level you have not previously encountered and did not fully believe existed until you encountered it in person. Morning would come back from this. He would have a career of profound excellence, a championship with the Miami Heat in 2006, a legacy that any rational assessment of the game would call great. But the moment lived in him in the way that certain moments live in certain people, not as defeat, which can be metabolized, but as information, which cannot be unfiled once received. Jordan did not celebrate. This is the detail that his teammates remembered most clearly in the years afterward when they told the story. The absence of external expression at the moment of completion. There was no fist pump of the kind he had produced in other moments. No look at morning. No gesture toward the crowd that had spent the entire game constructing the argument he had just answered. He turned, having released the ball with the full knowledge that it was going in, and began moving toward the visitor's bench in the way that a man moves toward a bench when the work he came to do is completed. Phil Jackson stood at the sideline with the expression he always wore when Jordan had done the thing that Jackson understood to be beyond his coaching, but not beyond his recognition. BJ, Armstrong would say later, in one of those post-game hallway conversations that happened in the space between the locker room and the bus, that Jordan had not said anything on the bench in the final minute that referenced pressure or importance or the magnitude of the moment. He had said, in the specific economy that Jordan used when he spoke about performance, something to the effect that he could see where the opening was going to be and that it was only a matter of time. BJ, Armstrong had understood, even as Jordan said it, that this was not false modesty and was not bravado. It was a literal description of what Jordan saw and felt when the trap closed, which was not danger but instruction. The trap told him where the opening would be. The two large bodies told him exactly where they were not. The opening was always where the large bodies were not. There is a principle that Jordan has articulated in various ways over the years, a principle that lives at the foundation of how he understood competition and himself as a competitor. It is not complicated in its statement, though it is extraordinarily demanding in its practice. It is this: that the pressure applied by opponents is not the problem, but the raw material. That the harder a situation presses, the more precisely it defines the available responses. That the trap, understood correctly, is not a trap at all, but a problem with exactly one elegant solution. And the work of preparation is not learning how to avoid traps, but learning how to find solutions fast enough that the trap becomes a demonstration rather than a difficulty. He had been working on this his entire life, and the working had begun long before basketball, in a childhood in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a household where standards were enforced without negotiation by parents who understood that comfort, extended beyond its proper season, becomes its own kind of cruelty. His father James had a way of raising the standard every time Michael reached the previous one, not cruelly, but consistently, in the specific way that people raise standards when they believe the person in front of them has not yet reached the ceiling of their capacity and probably never will. Michael Jordan had internalized this as methodology. Pressure was not the enemy of performance. Pressure was the condition under which performance revealed its true nature. The trap that Alonzo Mourning and Harold Miner had built around him in those final 4 seconds was the most recent in a long series of pressures that Jordan experienced as invitations rather than obstacles. His response to the invitation was always the same. He accepted it. He found the opening that the pressure had identified. He made the shot. The Chicago Bulls won Game 3 by 1 point. They would win the series and the championship, their third consecutive title, the completion of what history would call the first three-peat. Jordan would average 41 points per game in the finals against the Phoenix Suns, a performance that most serious analysts consider among the greatest sustained individual performances in the history of the sport. Harold Miner would play 4 more seasons in the NBA, producing moments of genuine beauty and never quite becoming the thing the nickname had promised. Alonzo Mourning would become one of the great players of his generation, a Defensive Player of the Year, a champion in 2006, a man whose career vindicated every belief he had ever held about his own capacity. He would speak in later years about Jordan with the specific quality of respect that can only be produced by having been on the losing end of something you could not explain. He did not describe it as defeat. He described it as education. There is a kind of defeat that diminishes the person who suffers it, and there is a kind of defeat that leaves them larger, because the encounter required them to discover something about the world they could not have discovered in comfort. Mourning chose the second kind of relationship to what happened in Miami on May 13, 1993. Not immediately and not easily, but eventually and permanently. Jordan moved forward without looking back, because looking back is the one luxury that the relentless pursuit of the next challenge does not permit. And he had chosen the pursuit completely and without reservation, the way some people choose a faith, which is to say, at a cost that only makes sense if the thing you are pursuing is worth exactly everything it asks of you. The United States Center grew quiet eventually, the way arenas always grow quiet after the crowd disperses, with the specific quality of absence that feels loaded rather than empty, as if the noise has only paused and might return. Somewhere on that floor was the precise spot where Michael Jordan had received the ball with 4 seconds on the clock, and 2 6'10" men arrayed against him, and a building full of people who had decided the story was over. The spot looked like every other spot on the floor. The lesson is not about basketball. The lesson is that the walls closing in around you are not evidence that you are finished. They are information about where the opening is, and the only thing standing between you and the place you are supposed to be is the decision to move toward it before the fear has finished making its argument.